This is a nice class to do. You know, in the past weeks, our classes have been pretty heavy material with covering the day of YHWH. The day of YHWH was not one of gladness. It was one of judgment, one where God repaid Israel for all of her sins. And he didn't just repay Israel for her sins, but it says he repaid them double for all their sins. So it was a very sad judgment, but a much needed judgment, because they had grown exceedingly wicked during that era. And we're going to do a quick recap, and then we're going to launch into the verses that talk about the day of y'all's salvation. Now, we are going to be going through this entire material again as we go through Deuteronomy. So today's class, we will finish with Leviticus 26. Then we're going to start in Deuteronomy 28. Now, when we start in Deuteronomy 28, if you look on page, let's see, this is going to be page 700 in your book, you will notice that when we study Deuteronomy 28 and the testimony there, we do it concurrently with the Leviticus 26 testimony that we've already studied. And for those of you that are new to the class, the word testimony means a prophecy. It is a word or a prophecy about something. And what the testimony does within the law of Moses is it establishes a chronological prophecy, basically a law, saying this is the law of prophecy. If you are a true prophet, you will prophesy according to this chronology, and this is the truth of what will happen in your future. Remember, probably about 4 or 5 classes ago, we went through all of the verses in Isaiah and Jeremiah, but mainly Isaiah, which talk about how YHWH had shown Israel from the beginning of her history. From the very beginning of her history, he had showed her what her end would be. So God had foretold everything that was to occur in Israel's history, and Israel's prophets, the righteous prophets in Israel, will pick up on that. They will follow. This is why you have Isaiah 8:16 and 20, which say, to the law and the testimony, they speak not according to this, there's no light in them. So when a prophet speaks according to the law, that means his doctrine is going to be in accord with the law of Moses. He is not going to contradict that. Likewise, when he prophesies of time events, things to happen in Israel's future, he is not going to contradict the chronology within the testimony. Now, just to recap, there are 2 testimonies technically. The testimony of Leviticus 26 was part of the Sinai covenant given when Israel first came out of Egypt, traditionally during Shavuot. But that was the first testimony. Israel rebelled. They wandered 40 years in the wilderness. God really used that time in the wilderness to test Israel, to put different situations, put them in different situations to see how they would react. You know, would they humble themselves? Would they be obedient to God's instructions, or would they rebel? Well, unfortunately, Israel's time in the wilderness showed God, it demonstrated that Israel rebelled no less than 10 times in the wilderness. So God knew that this project that he had undertaken with Abraham's seed, that it was going to be a very trying project. It was not going to, his plan of salvation was not going to be something that was going to occur easily. So from that, when he gave the covenant again, in Moab, Shechem. And I say Moab, Shechem because the covenant was given and offered by Moses to the children of Israel in the plains of Moab. They may have been 2-3 miles from Jericho before they crossed over Jordan and began to claim their inheritance. But what you find is that God offers them this covenant outside the land. Israel agrees to it. Israel accepts this covenant, but it's not fully ratified until they come to Shechem. And when they come to Shechem, you have 2 groups that are going to go on top of Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and they're going to issue the blessings and curses. And at that moment, that ceremony, unlike, all the other many of your other covenants are sealed with some sort of sacrifice. This covenant is not. This covenant is ratified with the blessings and the curses. So the Deuteronomy covenant then totally incorporates every aspect of Leviticus 26. It is going to incorporate every single blessing, every single curse that had been stated in Leviticus 26. But because God has this 40 years of history with Israel, because he understands what Israel is going to do when she is put into these stressful situations, and he knows her heart of rebellion, he adds a lot more detail in Deuteronomy 28. And he even adds a catch-all curse. If all those other curses of the law, the deporting them off of the land, the cursing them with diseases, causing famine, if all of those other curses did not heal Israel, then there was this one dreaded curse, the dreaded contingency that he would take out of his bag and God would employ against Israel. And it was this last curse that would heal Israel if all the others failed to do so. So we're going to begin to look at all of those as we get into Deuteronomy, and that will really cover the next 2 to 3 chapters. So chapter 15, the rest of chapter 14, all the way through chapter 17, we'll really focus on that. And then when we get into chapter 18, we're going to be focusing more on Ezekiel and see how important many of his prophecies are and how they are often overlooked. The 430 days of Ezekiel is not really understood to have any significance. Well, we're going to look to see how that was significant in our upcoming classes. So I just wanted to give you all kind of an overview of what we're going to be covering. Tonight, we're going to be focusing and finishing up Leviticus 26. This, again, was the covenant God made with Israel at Mount Sinai. This is where God says, if you walk in my ways and you will do according to my laws, then I will bless you. And he enumerates all the blessings he will give Israel. But by the same token, if Israel rebels, then these are the curses. And we saw that the curses of Leviticus 26 for 350 years were implemented in 7 times. Each of those 7 times was a 70-year time period that began with the fracturing of Judah and Israel during the days of Rehoboam in 944 BCE. And those 350 years continued until the fall of Jerusalem to Nebuchadnezzar. Jeremiah also establishes 70 years for the land to be desolate and for Israel to come back. When Israel does indeed come back, Daniel establishes 70 years, even though he says 70 weeks. It's actually 70 years that he establishes for Israel to stop sinning, for them to sanctify YHWH, and to sanctify the covenant. So Israel had this 70-year time period to walk in the way of YHWH. And if she did not, then she would be given up to the dreaded curses of the law. These were curses that were very harsh. They were not kind in any way. And we're going to discuss a little bit of that tonight as we recap the studies from the previous week. And then finally, we're going to focus on the majority of this class on the day of YHWH's salvation. And this is really going to incline more towards us today and the time period that the testimony places us living today. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go grab my slideshow and we are going to get started. All right. So as soon as I see that we are up and running, let me see how this looks on for you guys. And as soon as I see that it looks good for you guys, we will get going. So I'm just going to leave this up here for a moment so that it shows. Okay, good. And then we are going to continue on. All right. So this is where we're going to recap. Remember, Leviticus 26:43 we saw last week. This occurs after God has already reestablished Israel on the land after the 70 years of the land resting and enjoying its Sabbaths. And this is important because this occurs during the time of the Second Temple period. And this is what God says. It says, the land also shall be left to them and shall enjoy her Sabbaths. while she lies desolate without them, and they shall accept the punishment of their iniquity, because even they despise my judgments, and because their soul abhorred my statutes. So what we have is that Israel's land is going to be desolate. The people are going to live in their iniquity. They're not going to have healing. They are rather going to pine away in their sins, according to Ezekiel. So this is something where there is no healing, there is no restoration. And the real curse of this is enumerated within the day of YHWH, the day of judgment, where each man raises his hand against his brother. Remember, that was the curse that we found in the Noahic covenant of Genesis 9. Remember that the first part of the judgment had wild beasts coming against Israel, and even the nations. And then the latter part of that had each man raising his hand against his brother. And the way that these curses often work is that, especially in the Noahic covenant, is that it falls on Israel first primarily, but then it seems to spread out and affect all the other nations. So Israel is kind of the leader in all of this in some ways. You find that during the time that Nebuchadnezzar was one of these beasts that was marauding the nations, you find that other nations were deported. Elam was captured. You find that other nations within Syria was captured. So, and even parts of Egypt were captured. So these judgments did not just affect Israel. They really affected the cradle of civilization from Mesopotamia to Egypt. Later on during the day of YHWH, that judgment, it really spread out and was much broader because it affected people living in Rome, Italy, even Britain, ancient Germany. It really affected the entire quote unquote civilized world during that day. So the judgment that's enumerated in Leviticus 26, and we're just going to recap this really quick, says, and those that are left alive of you, I will send a faintness into their hearts in the land of their enemies, and the sound of a shaken leaf shall chase them, and they shall flee as fleeing from a sword, and they shall fall when none pursues, and they shall fall on one another as it were before a sword when none pursues, and you shall have no power to stand before your enemies. Now, let me just reiterate real quick, because some of the most horrid persecutions that we have, hold on, I'm going to grab a drink of water real quick, begin to occur during the reign of Nero. And this is, within a generation of the foundation of Christianity. We have some of the most notorious persecutions of both Jews and Christians within the Roman Empire. Tacitus tells us that he would put Christians on trial. And the key with Christianity at this point in time, modernly we think of Christianity being a religion that is to go forth to the Gentiles. It's a religion of all nations. But that's really not how it began. In its infancy, in its origins, Christianity was a movement within Judaism. It was really another sect of Judaism. And most of the people who believed in Christianity were Jews in the 1st and 2nd century. It wasn't until later on that you find more Greeks and people of other nations really kind of came into the fold. So what you find under the reign of Nero and under the reign of other Roman rulers is that persecution, where the Jews and Israelites have immigrated to their enemies' lands. And it is there because, even back then you had Jewish communities where they would live together. They would live in a separate community. They would observe their own customs. In some places, they even had a type of Sanhedrin that they could follow. But what you find is that this hatred of Jews, this anti-Semitism, and this hatred of this Torah observant people really begins very early on during the post-Christian era. Even for people that were not Christians, they still succumbed to this persecution in their enemies' lands. So let's continue with this. It says, and you shall perish among the heathen, and the land of your enemies shall eat you up. And they that are left of you shall pine away in their iniquity in your enemies' lands, and also in the iniquity of their fathers shall they pine away. So this is the idea that during the diaspora, there's not going to be healing. They're going to continue doing, believing in ideas and performing actions that are counterproductive for a healthy society. They're just not going to be a healthy people. They're going to be very dysfunctional. So the Second Temple remnant are deported off the land while an era of persecution against Jews and Christians begins. This is really what Leviticus 26, 36 through 39 enumerates. And then you go into 40 and 43, and it refers to the Jews once again being deported off the land. And you find that this does indeed happen under Rome, where Jews are actually banned from Jerusalem for a good 800 years, and they're not even allowed to come into Jerusalem, much less come in contact with the Temple Mount. So God's prophecy within the law is very much fulfilled, and we have record of that, thanks to Rome, believe it or not, of that persecution and that denial, that banishment from the land. So, but now we're going to come back to the law. So Leviticus 26:43 left Israel in diaspora. It said that the land would be left of Israel. But notice God's ultimate promise. Even though the Second Temple remnant rebelled, even though they, Ezra and Nehemiah give damning testimony against the Second Temple remnant. They had violated the Sabbath day. They had persecuted their brethren, doing the exact same thing with ignoring the release years and bringing their brethren into bondage that the elders had done during the days of Zedekiah, when Jeremiah tried to recovenant with YHWH, and he tried to encourage each man to let his Hebrew servant go free. Ezra gives us the exact same scenario occurring within the first 70 years of Israel being back on the land. So truly, Judah did indeed pine away in her father's sins, committed every error. You find in Ezekiel 14 where he talks about the men of Judah worshiping Tammuz. So you find that there really was nothing new under the sun. They really kept walking in their forefathers' sins. But even though they had rebelled, even though God was going to take them off the land, even though you had this horrible day of judgment, this day of YHWH, God's final promise still stands. So it didn't matter. Nothing Israel did, none of her sins, no matter how heinous or how hideous, could avert, could rescind, or could undo God's ultimate promise. So this is God's ultimate promise to the nation of Israel, to the seed of Abraham through Jacob. He says, and yet for all that, when they be scattered in the land of their enemies, I will not cast them away, neither will I abhor them to destroy them utterly, and to break my covenant with them. For I am YHWH their God, but I will for their sakes remember the covenant of their ancestors, whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the heathen, that I might be their God. I am YHWH. Now, remember in the last class that we did 2 weeks ago, and if you want to maybe go back and see this in the video, or even just look in your book, because it was right around page 686, I believe, somewhere right around in there. Remember how we looked at the word remember. And every time scripture states that YHWH remembered the covenant, that phrase every single time means that God actively acts on behalf of Israel. He brings them to the land. He works to make them a strong nation. He seeks to establish all the covenants. Remember, there were 4 covenants with Abraham. There were 2 covenants with Isaac. And then there were 3 covenants with Jacob. God seeks to actively establish and fulfill all of those covenants. The circumcision covenant, which is not just a circumcision of the foreskin, it's also a circumcision of the heart, to love Yahweh alone, to love his law, his way of life, and to put God first. So all of these are part of this God, of when God remembers the covenant. So Leviticus 26 is very broad in its promise, but God's ultimate promise stands. It really meets the definition of Yahovah being a faithful God. If you'll remember in chapter 1, my investigation began as a trial into God's righteousness. Was God a righteous God? And one of the definitions of truth and righteousness is that of faithfulness. And for God to say that, yet for all this, I mean, he's just enumerated how incredibly wicked they would be. But he says that even with all of this, no matter how wicked you are, this is my promise to you, and it will stand for all eternity. So because that promise has not been fulfilled, that it remains open today. We're going to look at the promises of when it will be fulfilled, and we're going to look at some reasons why it has not yet been fulfilled, as well as look at what each and every one of us can do to make those promises a reality, and not a reality in some far off future, but a reality in our day. So this, and let me not get ahead of myself, because when you go and read the prophets do not exist in a vacuum. And when you read the prophets, there is not one word that a prophet states that has not been foretold within the law or the Psalms. So a really good understanding when you read something in a prophet, go and see where he got his information from. The way and the order of prophecy, the way it works is everything begins within the law of Moses. The mishpat, the statutes of the law are really prophecy. David says in Psalms 119, 154, he states, your statutes have been the songs in the house of my pilgrimage. So what that means is that David and maybe even Asaph took the statutes of the law, whether it was the statutes of the continual sacrifice, whether it was the statute of 1 in 10 passing under the rod, whether it was a statute of burning incense. It really didn't matter what the statute was. Each of those statutes, because they existed, they were prophetic in nature. And David built on those and incorporated those into songs. But he wasn't the only one. Moses, there's a song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32, 33. You have another song of Moses within the book of Psalms. I think it's right around Psalms 80, somewhere around in there. The song of Deborah in Judges 5 is prophecy, not just for her day, but for later generations. You also find that David was not the only prophet during his day. He established Asaph and his sons, the sons of Korah, as temple prophets. This was prophecy as an office of state. You know, this is kind of mind-boggling because we think of prophecy as something that's really loosey-goosey, where the Spirit of God just falls on someone and they almost in a catatonic state, or they just have this revelation where all of a sudden they quote-unquote get it. This really is not the case. You find that prophecy was really more an act of scholarship, and a prophet had to be very careful what he said or what he wrote, or I should say he or she, because we have female prophets as well. But what they said in God's name, they had to be very careful, because there not only was there a chain of command, but there were rules and laws governing what they said. So they couldn't violate the law of Moses, and they couldn't violate the testimony of Leviticus 26 or Deuteronomy 28 through 30. So then after you have the testimony, you have the Psalms, then it trickles down through the prophets. And to really understand the prophetic framework, go study the prophets by the date, and not the order which they are in Scripture, because that is confusing in the Masoretic text, or the canon. But go back and look at the prophets by the date and from when they lived. Now, in chapter 8, let me see if I can find the page here really quick. I provided a chart that actually lists when each prophet lives, and that is going to be on page 325. There is each prophet, when he lived and who he was succeeded by. And if you will study the prophets in a chronological order, what you discover is that each succeeding prophet, his words grow. They are what's the word I'm looking for? They build on their predecessor, and they incorporate more facts and details. And sometimes they do add new details, but never do they contradict any of the details that have already been established. So anyways, just that with in mind, this is kind of the order in which, to really understand prophecy, that is the order in which it works. So now we're going to look at many of the prophets, the Psalms and the prophets, that establish this idea of God fulfilling his covenant. They really build, and they specifically refer to Leviticus 26, verses 45 and 46. So this is David, and this is what he says. He says, "Seek Yahweh and his strength, seek his face forevermore. Remember his marvelous works that he has done, his wonders and the judgments of his mouth. O you seed of Abraham, his servant, you children of Jacob, his chosen. He is Jehovah, our God. His judgments are in all the earth. He has remembered his covenant forever, the word which he commanded to 1,000 generations, which covenant he made with Abraham and his oath to Isaac, and confirmed the same with Jacob for a law, and to Israel for an everlasting covenant, saying, to you will I give the land of Canaan, the lot of your inheritance." Notice this command by David to remember the marvelous works of Yehovah. You find that David in Psalms 106 actually fulfills his own command, and he remembers the righteous works of Yehovah. You find that Ezra fulfills this command. He remembers the righteous works of Yehovah. Deborah remembers the righteous works of Yehovah, as does Samuel. This idea of remembering what God has done, remembering the past, is reiterated over and over and over again throughout the prophets. And in volume 2, I will also remember many of God's righteous works, because it is in remembering those righteous works where this trial of Israel versus Yehovah. Are Yehovah's ways unjust? Are they unfair, or are they equal? It is really in remembering the works he has done and the judgments that he has issued that we can finally come to a rational conclusion based on the evidence, and really see for ourselves whether God has been just and righteous in his dealings with Israel, or whether he has been unmerciful and he has sinned. So this will be kind of a kind of, I guess, perhaps climax to all the other information that's in volume 2, when we look over the last 4,000 years of human history of God's interaction with the children of Israel, and we really remember what he has done, that I think we really gain some perspective. So just kind of going off into the volume 2 there for a moment. So this is again in Psalms, this time Psalms 111. Says, the works of his hands are verity and judgment. All his commands are true. They stand fast forever and ever, and they are done in truth and uprightness. He sent redemption to his people. He has commanded his covenant forever. Holy and revered is his name. The fear of Jehovah is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all they that do his commandments. His praise endures forever. So notice again, David is building on this idea of his covenant being commanded forever. So there is no annulling the covenant, no matter what Israel does. even if they are driven off the land, even if they are slaughtered in the lands of their enemies, that covenant still awaits them. The question is, how then does Israel come to a place where they have access to the covenant, where they have access to the promises, and where God is working on their behalf once more? And we're going to look at that in a little bit, but we're going to look at some other verses first. So what is the covenant God has promised to 1,000 generations, as David says in Psalms 111? And this again, we're going to read again Leviticus 44 through 45. It says, and yet for all that, when they're in the land of their enemies, I will not cast them away. I will not abhor them, will not destroy them utterly, or break my covenant with them. I will remember the covenant with their ancestors. So again, there's nothing Israel can do to make God break his word. This is in essence the definition of righteousness. Where we often think of the story of the prodigal son in the New Testament. And that story of the prodigal son is truly apropos to what God has done with Israel, although he has not given a blessing to a different heir. But if you think of the prodigal son as God's firstborn son, as his rightful heir, and as his only son in many ways, then that would be a more direct and applicable parable, where Israel is God's only son, but yet what do? They trash their inheritance. They do not appreciate the liberty and the justice and this constitution that is established in God's law, and they really throw it away. They despise their inheritance. But it is still there for them the moment that they come to a place of obedience. So Isaiah builds on this idea, and Isaiah adds a little bit more information. So this is what Isaiah says. Now, when he talks about a little wrath, remember that Nehemiah had talked about a little space of grace was afforded to the second temple remnant, and how it would be a little bit of time of relief for the coming judgment that was determined. But this is also a reference here to Deuteronomy 32 and the Song of Moses, where God states that he will hide his face from Israel, that he will no longer work on his behalf. And when they call out to him, he will not hear them, because remember, in other places within the Tanakh, the Old Testament, we have verses that state that God will not hear the prayer of a wicked man. There has to be some sort of turning from your sins before God is willing to give you an ear. So God's hiding of his face occurred during the day of judgment, when all the evil came upon them, and there was really no salvation for the nation during that time. So this is, Isaiah builds on all these ideas when he says, for a small moment have I forsaken you, but with great mercies will I gather you. In a little wrath I had hid my face from you for a moment, but with everlasting kindness I have mercy on you. And said Yahweh your Redeemer, for this is as the waters of Noah to me. For I have sworn that the waters of Noah should no more go over the earth. So have I sworn that I will not be angry with you nor rebuke you. For the mountains shall depart and the hills shall be removed, but my kindness shall not depart from you. Neither shall the covenant of my peace be removed, says Yahovah that has mercy on you. And all your children shall be taught of Yahovah, and great shall be the peace of your children. So a couple of very important things here. Number one, God has said, just like that rainbow in Genesis 9, where God says that he will never again destroy the earth by a flood. God makes the same promise to Israel, only instead of a flood, he is saying that he will never again be angry with Israel, to deport them off the land, to cause them to go through the Holocaust ever again. So this is an incredible promise, one that has yet to be fulfilled, because there still are ongoing persecutions of both Jews and Christians, the descendants of Abraham, throughout many of the nations of the world today. You also find that Israel is not yet a nation of peace. They still have wars and conflict, and of course, the BDS movement and all of that. But here God talks about this covenant of peace, and Jeremiah also builds on this idea of a covenant of peace. So what are exactly the covenants of peace? And I'm not going to read this, but I'm just going to bring it to your attention. The very first covenant of peace that we had mentioned in Scripture is the one where Phinehas, or Phinehas, came to Yahweh's defense when Israel rebelled against God. And his jealousness, his zeal on Yahweh's behalf in executing judgment turned Yahweh's wrath away from his people because they had rebelled. This was like their 9th time or 10th time to rebel against him. And because Phinehas was willing to do this, God offered him a covenant of peace. And what that meant was that in times of judgment, where the nation or even the priesthood rebelled against Yahweh, that Phinehas and his house, though they may face the brunt of judgment because they were a leadership, they had a role of leadership within the community, his seed, his children, would never be exterminated. He would never, unlike Ahab, whose house would absolutely perish and he would have no descendants, it says in the congregation of the latter days. Both Phinehas as well as David will have descendants in the congregation in the latter days. So when we are gathered again, they will have Konim as well as Melech within the children of Israel. And this here, I'm just going to read this real quick. This is just kind of a synopsis of the covenants of peace. It says, and this is what I wrote. It says, God offered the second covenant to David. Both of these covenants were peace treaties between Yahweh and David and Phinehas' offspring. Phinehas and David were responsible for ruling the people and ensuring that righteousness and justice prevailed in the land. Yahweh's peace covenant granted extraordinary mercy to these two houses when the nation rebelled. Yahweh had previously awarded covenants to Abraham due to his obedience. So this is very similar. And you find that God's covenant with David is very telling throughout the books of Kings and Chronicles. When the kings rebelled, you find that the author writes, nevertheless, God would not destroy them because he had promised David to always have a light in Jerusalem or in Judah. And it's mentioned like 4 or 5 times that God would not execute judgment on David's house because of for the sake of his covenant with David. When the most notorious Stalin-like king, Manasseh, ruled over Judah, God did not even kill Manasseh, but rather deported him to Assyria, humbled him, and then reestablished him on the throne. So God showed extraordinary mercy to the kings that reigned after David for the sake of the covenant of peace that God had made with David. So this type of infinite mercy, this type of mercy that really goes beyond reasonable limits, is what God is going to exhibit with Israel once more when they're reestablished on the land. Jeremiah builds again on this idea that there is nothing Israel could ever do that would disannul his covenants with the nation of Israel or his covenants with the houses of David and Phinehas. And this is what it says. Thus says Yahweh, which gives the sun for a light by day and the ordinances of the moon and the stars for a light by night, which divides the seas when the waves thereof roar. Yahweh of hosts is his name. If those ordinances depart from before me, says Yahweh, then the seed of Israel also shall cease from being a nation before me forever. Thus says Yahweh, if heaven above can be measured and the foundations of the earth searched beneath, I will also cast off the seed of Israel for all they have done, says Yahweh. Well, Jeremiah is given an extent, a limit that cannot be met. The ordinances and the laws that keep our days in 24-hour time frames and keeps the seasons in place, you know, as our circuit around the sun, those are still in place. So if those rules and those laws of the universe are still in place, so is God's rule and his law regarding his covenant with Israel. It cannot be disannulled. And here is the parallel. You know, and we're going to see this in greater detail, the parallel between Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 30. So this is Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 through, I think, about verse 5. But this totally parallels Leviticus 26, verses 44 and 45. And the corollary states in Deuteronomy's testimony, I will gather them out of all countries where I have driven them in my anger and in my fury and in my great wrath. And I will bring them again to this place, and I will cause them to dwell safely. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God. And I will give them one heart, one way, that they may fear me forever, for the good of them and their children after them. Oh, I'm sorry, this is Jeremiah, not Deuteronomy. Okay, so this is Jeremiah 32. It says, and I will make an everlasting covenant with them, and I will not turn away from them to do them good, but I will put my fear in their hearts, that they shall not depart from me. Yes, I will rejoice over them to do them good, and I will plant them in this land, assuredly with my whole heart and my whole soul. For thus says Yahweh, like as I have brought all this great evil upon this people, so will I bring them all the good that I have promised them. And for those of you guys that listen to Ross, he points out this is the only thing in all of Scripture that YHWH states he will do with all his heart and all his soul. So this is pretty astounding. With all his heart and with all his soul, God will bring the children of Israel back to the land. It doesn't matter where they have been scattered, he will bring them back. And this again reiterates this idea of reestablishing and remembering the covenant. Now, Psalms 106 is where God acts again on Israel's behalf when he actually remembers. This is what David writes. It says, and he remembered for them his covenant and repented according to the multitude of his mercies. He made them also to be pitied of all those that carried them away captives. Save us, O YHWH, our God, and gather us from among the heathen, to give thanks to your holy name and to triumph in your praise. Blessed be YHWH, the God of Israel, from everlasting to everlasting. Let the people say amen. Now, what David is referring to here is that at the first Exodus, when Israel left Egypt, God caused the Israelites to be pitied among the Egyptians. And a matter of fact, they borrowed from their Egyptian neighbors and they utterly plundered the Egyptians because they pitied them and they were afraid of them. It's very possible that we will have a similar occurrence at the final redemption, where God does something very miraculous to bring Israel's descendants back to the land. And now this is where Deuteronomy is the corollary here, Deuteronomy 30 to Leviticus 26. It says, and you shall return to YHWH your God, and you will obey his voice according to all that I command you this day, you and your children, with all your heart and with all your soul, that then Yahweh your God will turn your captivity and have compassion on you, and will return and gather you from all nations where Yahweh your God has scattered you. And if any of yours be driven out to the utmost parts of heaven, from there will Yahweh your God gather you, and from there will he fetch you. And Yahweh your God will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you will possess it. And he will do you good and multiply you above your fathers. And Yahweh your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed to love Yahweh your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live. So when the prophets talk about Israel returning to the land, they talk about gathering from the four corners of the earth, they are getting that idea from the testimony established within the law of Moses. And this is why you see it reiterated something like 46 different times in the prophets, this idea of God gathering Israel from the four corners of the earth. And this is another verse in Deuteronomy. This is not within the testimony, but it is still a promise within the law nonetheless. It says, "And Yahweh shall gather you from among the nations, and you shall be left few in number among the heathen, whereas Yahweh shall lead you. And there you will serve gods, the work of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see, hear, or eat, or smell. But if you will from there seek Yahweh your God, you will find him, if you seek him with all your heart and soul. When you are in tribulation and all these things are come upon you, even in the latter days, if you turn to Yahweh your God and shall be obedient to your voice, to his voice, for Yahweh your God is a merciful God, and he will not forsake you, nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant of your fathers which he swore to them." So this verse single-handedly has the answer for why salvation has waited for so long. And it also has the answer for what you and I can do today to affect God's salvation, to affect God's return to Israel. And that is the command: seek him with all your heart and soul. Become obedient to his voice. Remember, God's voice spoke out of the fire at Mount Sinai when God gave the 10 Commandments. God's voice spoke many, many times to Moses as he wrote the law of Moses. So when we obey the covenant, when we obey the laws, rules, and regulations listed in the Pentateuch, we are fulfilling this command. We are actively making a contribution towards the restoration of Israel. Now, why did this restoration not occur in previous time periods? Well, if you look at our history for the past 2,000 years, it really doesn't matter whether you're on the Christian side of Judaism or whether you are on the traditional Judaism itself side where you follow the Talmud and the rabbis. Each of those splinters of Israel continually add, delete, or change the word of Yahweh. They change his instructions so that they are not following that original voice that spoke to Israel, but rather they're following the voice of their leaders that change God's word. So only now have we kind of become full circle where we are humbled, we are peeled, and we are really willing to obey God's voice alone. And more than that, we actually trust him. You know, for 2,000 years, Israel has said, your way is not sufficient. Your way is unequal. Whether it's saying that our fathers eat sour grape and their children's teeth are set on edge, we've had all of these excuses we have made for why we can't. But what Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 30 refer to is a generation that no longer says, I can't, but they give all the reasons for why they can. And they are finally willing, and they finally do it. And then the promise here is that when it says that God will not forget, well, if he hasn't forgotten, it means that he remembers. So Moses is again saying that God will remember the covenant that God swore to Israel's ancestors in Moab and Sinai. So now the big question, the question that inquiring minds want to know: when is the day of salvation? Do we have some sort of time period that we can look at to expect this wonderful event where there will eventually be peace on earth? So when we look at Hosea gives us a very definite time period. It says, come and let us return to Yahweh, for he has torn and he will heal us. He has smitten and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us, and the third day he will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight. Then shall we know if we go on to follow Yahweh. His going forth is prepared as the morning, and he shall come to us as the rain, as the latter rain and the former rain to the earth. So this whole idea of latter rain is not just earthly blessing, but it's also this idea of circumcision of the heart, as well as what Ezekiel reiterates, this pouring out of the Spirit of God upon Israel. But the key to this, the key to chronology, is this idea that after 2 days, so the limit is after 2 days, but less than the third day. And Israel reckoned time a little bit differently than what we do today. You know, for us, when we look at in mathematics, if we are looking at a number, say from 1 to 10, if the number is 5, we are going to round up to 10 if we're estimating. But if we have the number 4, we're going to round down to 1. Because that is just the tradition. That's what appears logical to us today and how we figure mathematics and statistics. It seems to work differently in Israel. And it even seems that the North had a different way of figuring their mathematics than did Judah. So Hosea was in the North, and he figured mathematically a little bit different. These would have been scribal protocols that would have been established, whether they were schools of learning or something that just developed as a tradition. You know, we don't know what colleges existed at that time to know how the learning was disseminated. But what we do know is that it appears in the North anything above a terminus. So say you had 4.1. 4.1 would be rounded up to 5, whereas if you just had 4, it would stay at 4. In the South, they appear to have been perhaps a little bit more using it the way we do modernly, where anything under 5 would have been rounded down to 4. So it was a different way of performing mathematical calculations and estimations. But for Hosea, there's this idea of 2 and 3 days. Well, where does Hoshea, where does he get this idea? And in all of the Tanakh, there is really only one statute that really established this. And it's not so much established within the Tanakh, within the law of Moses itself, but it's established much later during the monarchy by David and Solomon. Remember King David, when he established Solomon as co-regent shortly before his death. He handed to Solomon the blueprints of the temple that David had designed. And David tells Solomon, he says, all of these designs I had in the spirit of YHWH. And he showed me how the temple should be fashioned. YHWH showed me how it should be shaped. And then he gave those to Solomon. The importance of that is that temple structure was very prophetic of events to occur in Israel's future, whether it was the daily sacrifice that depicted Israel's future holocausts, you know, this sacrifice that would never be consumed, or it would never die out until Israel's final restoration, or whether it was the one bringing 1 in 10 under the rod. Each of these ceremonies is associated with the temple and with coming before the face of YHWH had very specific implications in Israel's history. And this is where I see Hosea builds upon the statutes, even within Second Chronicles. So this is the statute regarding the basin, the molten sea that Solomon made. And again, this wasn't just Solomon making this. David had handed this blueprint to him when he established Solomon as co-regent. And this is what scripture says regarding the molten sea. It says, he made a molten sea of 10 cubits from brim to brim, round in compass, and 5 cubits in height thereof, and a line of 30 cubits did compass it round about. And under it was the similitude of oxen, which did compass it round about, 10 and a cubit, compassing the sea round about. 2 rows of oxen were cast. When it was cast, it stood upon 12 oxen, 3 looking to the north, 3 looking to the west, 3 to the east, 3 to the south. And the sea was set above them, and their hinder parts were inward. And the thickness of it was a handbreadth, and the brim of it was like the brim of a cup, with flowers and lilies, and it received, and it held 3,000 baths. Now, this symbolism within the molten sea is very important. We have 12 tribes of Israel. We have 12 oxen. We have 3 tribes going in 4 directions. Just as Israel surrounded the tabernacle in the wilderness, it was the same scenario and the same setup with 3 tribes to the north, to the east, to the south, and to the west. The exact same scenario. And above them, above these oxen, which, they're going out. The depiction is that they're going out and away from each other. They're going to be facing the law of entropy as they keep walking out and away. But what you find that they're holding is this enormous bathtub, basically, that holds 3,000 baths of water. And the idea is the idea of cleansing. Cleansing will take place during the diaspora, where the tribes are dispersed into all nations. Now, in Chronicles, we have 3,000 baths being used, and it appears the question is there a contradiction in Kings, which formulates and figures the number of baths differently. And this is what Kings says. It says, and it was a handbreadth thick, and the brim thereof was wrought like the brim of a cup with flowers of lilies. It contained 2,000 baths. So one author says 2,000 baths, another says 3,000. The reality is that it was probably somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 baths. It's just that in Judah, they round down, whereas another scribe from another school would have rounded up. That is, at least on the literature on the subject, that is what I've come across. So what if these 2,000 baths or 3,000 baths represent years? So like Hosea says, after 2,000 years, but before 3,000 years, he will restore Israel. So when and this is just a depiction of the molten sea, there is some literature or some web links that I can post that is very interesting when you get into the geometry and the mathematics of this sea. There's a lot of really good websites that show that the circumference of the molten sea actually contains pi. So that's a very interesting study if you like mathematics. And I'm not talking about numerology or anything like that, but just pure mathematics that really didn't develop until a little bit later in history. Around, I think it was the 4th or 6th century, you begin to find some mathematical ideas such as this occurring in Greek literature. But anyways, coming back to the molten sea, it's this idea, this is a very big basin, and the idea of cleansing Israel throughout and during the diaspora. She pines away in her sins, her iniquities correct her. Jeremiah, I think it's Jeremiah 4:19 states, or maybe it's 4:18, it states that your own way will correct you, even though it is harsh and bitter. So the correction will bring its own cleansing. So 2,000 baths, 2,000 years, 3,000 baths, 3,000 years. Again, the reality is somewhere between the two. So if we put this to a time period, Israel is cast off in 587 BCE, and the minimal extent of Israel's diaspora will be 2,000 years. So there was a possibility that in 1413 CE, God could have begun to restore Israel. That was open to possibility. It really rested on the people. Were they seeking him with all their heart? Were they returning to him? Were they calling upon his name? Were they forsaking their traditions and their doctrines of men that they had grown up with And were they returning to Yahweh? Well, we really don't find this kind of return to God until we get to the early 1800s. So about almost 400 years later, we find people throughout the United States and Europe really begin this return to God and the return to the law of Moses within Christianity. And this movement continues, and you and I are really part of this continuing and ongoing movement that has kind of evolved with the first steps of people saying, well, wait a minute, if we get rid of this, it contradicts this over here, and actually beginning to think for ourselves when we read for the scripture and not just regurgitate what we have heard or what's been passed down through the ages. So now I want to shift gears into this final idea of restoration and this final promise of what this day of salvation will look like when it is established and when God does it for Israel. So you and I are living at a point in time where, according to the structure of the tabernacle, even according to the law of Leviticus 26, the testimony of Leviticus 26, and we will see as we continue our studies, according to the testimony of Deuteronomy 28 and Deuteronomy 30, we are living at a point in time where salvation is open. It is open access. What awaits is us seeking, returning, and obeying. And when we do that, the righteousness, the impetus, the burden of fulfilling falls upon Yahweh. And if he is a righteous God, then he will have to act. I mean, if you understand what righteousness is and how it works, if God does not stand up to save and deliver a righteous people who call out to him, who give him no rest, a people that seek to obey his word, he cannot ignore that. It would be the same as a parent who has a child, where the child does everything that the parent asks. And if that child is in some sort of dire straits, some sort of tribulation that he has not brought on himself, but is brought around by the people around him, then if that parent has that ability to deliver their child at that time, then that obligation really falls on the parent. The same thing for Yahweh. When there becomes a righteous people, a righteous remnant, that obligation falls on Yahweh. And because he is faithful, because he is righteous, he will remember his covenants and he will reestablish them. You know, and it is possible for us to see it in our days. It's possible for our children to see it in their days. And I think as this back to central movement, back to the way of Yahweh, the restoring of Abrahamic faith, as that occurs, we are going to see, I believe, more and more incredible things in our days. So I'm going to close tonight with the incredible things that Zephaniah states will occur with this final restoration. So this is what Zephaniah says. The remnant of Israel shall not do iniquity, nor speak lies, neither shall a deceitful tongue be found in their mouths. For they shall feed and lie down, and none will make them afraid. Again, this is not yet Israel, because there's quite a few powers in and around the area that can make them afraid. So sing, O daughter of Zion, shout, O Israel, and be glad and rejoice with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. Yahweh has taken away your judgment. He has cast out your enemy. And the King of Israel, even Yahweh, is in the midst of you, and you will not see evil anymore. In that day it shall be said to Jerusalem, fear you not, and to Zion, let not your hands be slack. Yahweh your God is in the midst of you. He is mighty. He will save. He will rejoice over you with joy. He will rest in his love. He will joy over you with singing. I will gather them that are sorrowful for the solemn assembly, who are of you, and to whom the reproach of it was a burden. Behold, at that time I will undo all that afflict you. Think of that for a moment. Could you imagine Israel being restored to a land, living in peace, and God undoing all that afflict her? And I will save her that halts and gather her that was driven out, and I will get them praise and fame in every land where they have been put to shame. And that time I will bring you again, even in the time that I gather you, for I will make you a name and a praise among all the people of the earth, when I turn back your captivity before your eyes, says YHWH. So the entire process is really about a 3 or 4 step process. The process begins with us returning to YHWH, seeking YHWH, becoming obedient to his law, us crying out to him. But then the final process is YHWH himself turning our captivity, remembering his covenants. This is where God responds to us in a very active way. He turns our captivity and he restores us to the land. And this is where we find the final blessing and these final promises that God has given to Israel finally being fulfilled, and being fulfilled in a way that really Israel has never experienced. Even during the time of David, I don't think Israel has experienced this type of salvation to this great extent, for one reason and one reason alone, is that, yes, Israel probably followed YHWH during the days of David because they had righteous leadership. But for the most part, the nation, anytime the leader faltered, they had all their other gods right there with them. When we study the archaeology, we find that Israel consistently, from the days of the judges all the way down throughout the 7th, 8th, 6th century, they always commingled the worship of YHWH with the worship of other deities. They never had a single heart for YHWH. They never had a singleness to their God. It was always, let's not put all of our eggs in one basket, but let's mitigate our risk by appealing to every deity. So I think this restoration will be a brand new experience. It will be something new that the world has never seen before, something Israel has never experienced. And this is where, when you read, if you do a word search with your Englishman's Concordance, or if you have a Bible program, just grab your Englishman's Concordance and look up the 2 phrases. Look up the phrase new day or new song. Whenever you see those phrases being used, this is what it refers to. This is a new experience. Solomon reiterates over and over again how there's nothing new under the sun. Every evil that has been devised has been devised. But this era of righteousness, where we don't devise evil anymore, but rather we actually devise righteousness and goodness, where we no longer pick up a sword against another nation. Nations no longer fight each other. And we all actually want peace. We actually desire peace. This is a new step for Israel. It's a new step for human history. And the human experience. So this will be a new day. It will be an experience that will create life and health and establish all the blessings. Sorrow will be no more, and joy will come in the morning. So all of these are ideas that we find that are established within the testimony. And next week, we're going to find that they are not just established in the testimony, but that they are given greater detail. So anyways, with that, I'm going to close out the class. If there are any questions, please type your questions into the comment box. I am more than happy to go over them. A few quick announcements. Ross is teaching tomorrow, so I invite everyone to join us at United Israel here on YouTube. But the following 2 weeks, Ross will be in the land, and I will be filling in for him at United Israel. I do not know on the 3rd, which will be our next class, I do not know if I will be here or if I will be at the building. I will probably be up at the building. I just don't know what the access will be. So I will try to get started a little bit early with setting everything up, and hopefully there will be no glitches. But just be aware that if I have technical difficulties, because I will be at a different place next weekend, we'll make it up perhaps Sunday afternoon, but at some point in time, we'll make it up for the next class, because I do want to stay on schedule for the next couple weeks. So any comments or questions? I appreciate each of you guys being here. If you don't mind, hit the thumbs up button. It always helps with viewerships when you do that. And anyways, well, I will go ahead and close it out. I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and you're having better weather. And we'll see you next week. Shabbat Shalom.